Now for more insight on the election, let's bring in Myung-koo Kang, Professor of Political Science at Baruch College. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Rachelle.
Now let's start with your reaction to the election. What do you think it was about Moon Jae-in's platform that really resonated with voters?
It basically reflects those people who supported the impeachment. So more than 75% of South Korean people supported the impeachment of the former president Park Geun-hye, and that supporting for the impeachment has been reflected in this election.
Now, we know that people are concerned about the economy there. So what does Moon Jae-in's victory mean then for the future of South Korea's economy?
Great question. South Korea has been plunged into long stagnation for the past decade, especially after the global financial crisis of 2008. So annual economic growth rate went below 3%, but on the other hand, annual debt growth rate went over 6%. So in other words, that level of household has increased much faster than annual economic growth rate. And as a result, many people could not find their jobs, especially younger people. So such kind of dissatisfaction about the economic reality is quite closely reflected in this election.
And we certainly saw young voters really have their voices heard, an overwhelming number of them coming out to vote. So obviously the president-elect is going to have a lot to handle. So what should the top priorities be for the incoming president?
During the presidential campaign, President-elect Moon Jae-in and his camp made it quite clear job creation will be his priority. So the Moon Jae-in President-elect administration will focus on expanding government spending. So expansionary fiscal measures would be adopted at least to boost job market, particularly in the public sector, not only in the government sector, but at the same time, public corporations. I think that would be a quite short-term boosting measures which would be adopted by this new administration. But from a longer-term or medium-term point of view, the new administration needs to narrow down the gap between employment and economic productivity. For instance, in the South Korean industrial structure, those big companies, Samsung and Hyundai, those major big companies hire less than 15% of workers. And the majority, more than 85% of workers are employed by small and medium-sized enterprise.
Right.
So how to increase the competitiveness of these small and medium-sized companies would be quite critical in terms of creating more jobs in the private sector from a long-term point of view.
And how do you think these election results will really shape South Korea's economic and trade ties with other countries?
Definitely, right now, as you know well, South Korea has some tension because of the THAAD deployment with China. But the China is #1 trading partner of South Korea. So more than 22% of South Korean trade is related with China. So China is #1 trading partner. So from the South Korean government's national economic interest point of view, South Korea needs to respect this economic relations with China. In fact, China's share of trade in South Korea's trade volume is more than 2 times of the United States or Japan.
Right.
So it's larger than the combined volume with United States and Japan. On the other hand, and Trump administration pressured upon the South Korean government that renegotiating the free trade agreement. But it has been relatively short. So we need to take into account not only trade relations with the United States, but at the same time, cross-border capital flows. So
right.
In the Korean stock market and financial market, U.S. investors invest a lot of money and gained a lot of profit, especially from those well-performing Samsung Electronics and then Hyundai Motors and all those major Korean big companies.
Right.
So ultimately, I think a South Korean new administration will not launch any kind of radical shift in terms of foreign economic policies.
Now, you mentioned a lot of these family-owned businesses, these so-called chaebols. We know that a lot of candidates ran against that. Obviously, the corruption scandal with Park Geun-hye is still fresh on the minds of voters. What is all this doing for the business climate in South Korea?
From a historical point of view, those Korean chaebols, big businesses, they got a lot of financial support from the government in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So from the South Korean people's point of view, those big chaebols, big companies have quite collusive and non-transparent relations with the politicians. And then how to improve this non-transparent, collusive relations between the government and then chaebols has been one of the most important political issue in the presidential election.
Right.
So the Moon Jae-in new administration will focus on while cooperative, but at the same time not collusive. It's a little bit tricky issue. So I may use a kind of analogy. It's a kind of brain surgery. So the new administration needs to adopt a really cautious and then prudent approach in dealing with these chaebol issues.
I know it's a delicate balancing act. We'll have to leave there, unfortunately. Thanks to Myung-koo Kang, Professor of Political Science at Baruch College.